Welcome to Payments Canada Summit, and thank you for being here. I am Nancy Tadros, Director of High Value Payments at Central One. I'll be your host, and today we're talking about real-time fraud. Very interesting topic, I may say. Since the pandemic, card present or non-present, the debit card usage has surged, and so has payment fraud. As financial institutions ramp up their payment fraud prevention efforts to keep up, they may end up with higher rates of false positives. So, blocking genuine transactions, causing customer friction, and resulting in negative impact on revenue is an issue. So, how can a financial institution achieve that balance of staying ahead of fraudsters while protecting customers' accounts and information? Let's get to intros and then to our discussion. Welcome, everyone. Nice to have you with us. Andrew, let's start with you.
Well, I'd like to say hello to everybody. My name's Andrew Obee. I'm the CEO of the Ficanex group of companies. Ficanex is a pair of limited partnerships that the partners are Tier 2 financial institutions, both banks and credit unions across the country. We run a shared services full function surcharge-free ATM network, and we have a technology integration platform that we call Tunnel. Our objective is really to help Tier 2 financial institutions, be able to bring new and innovative services to support their business as they work to meet the needs of their customers. It's great to be here today.
Thank you. Ugan, would you like to go next?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ugan Naidoo, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at INETCO Systems. We are a Vancouver-based software company that's been supplying payment solutions to banks, processors, and other financial institutions in over 35 countries. We've been doing this for, I would say, roughly 30 years. Our speciality and expertise lies in our ability to capture and audit transactions. We provide the end-to-end visibility of payment transactions, like ISO 8583, ISO 20022, just to name a few. We do this specifically to detect and prevent fraud in real time across all channels using machine learning and behavioral analytics. So with that brief overview, it's a real pleasure being here with you today and allowing us to share some of our insights and experiences.
Thank you. Last but of course not least, Stephanie.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Payment Canada session. I'm Stephanie Z. I'm with the Bank of Montreal in the Enterprise Fraud Management team. The Enterprise Fraud Management team is one of the 4 pillars under the Financial Crimes Unit. Myself, along with my peers in EFM, provide end-to-end fraud lifecycle prevention and detection tactics, tools, and discussions with clients to prevent fraud on their behalf and on behalf of the bank.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's a true pleasure to have you all on this panel. So let's start with our first question. I think we can all agree that the pandemic had a tremendous impact on both consumer spending and fraud. But can you tell me from your perspectives, what changes in consumer behavior have you noticed overall through the past year and a bit? And what type of fraud have emerged since the pandemic? We'll start with Stephanie and then Ugan and Andrew.
Thank you. The pandemic created a situation akin to the perfect storm, if you will. We had in the marketplace more than 15 billion data records that have been stolen since 2013. And of course, all of this data that has been stolen has no time limit for use. And it is being able to piece those different pieces of information together that the fraudsters are exceptionally good at. The pandemic also caused every small business, every medium-sized business who have not yet had a web footprint or a good web footprint to embellish their services, the delivery, goods through the web, and in that time they may not have been able to stand up the appropriate or robustness around security and management. Then we also had the governments put a ton of money into the street as well to ensure that people were still able to manage through the very difficult times. And then, of course, as we are doing a virtual seminar, caused everybody to do everything virtually, put all of the workers to work from home, creating additional avenues and endpoints for bad actors to enter into our systems. So all of these pieces culminated together for the fraudsters to be able to really actively pursue fraud in multiple different ways through multiple different channels across all the different payment or product types across any of the financial institutions. So all of that change from both a workplace perspective and a consumer perspective created that opportunity for not only the syndicated or sophisticated fraudsters to drive harder and faster and have greater opportunities because of the dollars on the street and the management of workers, et cetera, where we were at, but it also created a lot of opportunistic fraudsters to come out of the woodwork as well and try and, as they say, throw spaghetti against the wall and see what stuck. And in many cases, they were successful. And again, this is an unprecedented time with the amount of change that happened in a very short period of time without controls necessarily that we wanted to have into place. And we've seen that explosion and that exploitation in fraud losses, in fraud types, and in fraud attempts across the spectrum of different payment types.
Ugan, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, just continuing with some of the threads that Stephanie has put down, certainly from our perspective, we've noticed that COVID-19 had accelerated the digital transformation. While many businesses have been preparing for this for the past few decades, no one anticipated it in almost a step change as we've seen, in the sheer magnitude in just the last year itself. It forced consumers that ordinarily wouldn't and didn't transact online to the digital world. People that lived most of their lives using cash and checks were now forced to use their cards and mobile devices to transact. These people were a ripe target for crime syndicates that would use all avenues, like social engineering, including phishing, farming, malware, to gain unauthorized access to the account or identity, with the sole intention of defrauding these individuals. And even for those of us who were already transacting online, the volume of these transactions shot up dramatically, which meant fraud and risk models were somewhat inaccurate for a period of time. And this opened the door to fraudsters, even if it was for just a brief moment. Alternative payment methods are growing at a faster rate globally than traditional payment networks. And we know it will surpass them in just a matter of time. With this, we have seen a rise in fraud incidents associated with real-time payments as fraudsters saw the opportunity and targeted new channels. At a global level, we saw an increase in identity theft, account takeovers, and some digital wallet account hacks as well. But I think on the sort of retail space itself, online retailers saw a spike in a particular kind of account takeover, that being buy online, pick up in store fraud. And this year, we expect a rising number of malware-based man-in-the-middle attacks. One more key item, electronic Know Your Customer, or EKYC for short, has gained traction in some parts of the world. With COVID-19, obviously, we know many organizations are moving more to electronic account opening processes. Where there are vulnerabilities in these processes, you can be sure, fraudsters will exploit these, especially with the rise in synthetic identity creation. So these huge changes in the way we as consumers are meant to interact, significant cost pressures on the part of retailers and banks, reduced manpower, all largely driven by the pandemic, has brought with it different ways of working, and as a consequence, a different set of fraud patterns.
Yeah, that's interesting. Andrew, what's your perspective?
Well, I think largely the talk's been covered by Ugan and Stephanie, but there's just a couple of other areas that I thought I'd maybe tweak in on. I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the consumer behavior dimensions that are some of the drivers. And I think it's important people kind of think about, the reality that consumers are now sitting with much more time on their hand. They're not occupied at other things, and they're looking for ways to fill that void. Some of them are heading online. Ugan talked about the increase in the use of digital payments and technology to conduct e-commerce transactions, and that's certainly true. Just from the current state or regular state perspective, but it's also true that folks are buying things they would never have bought before, spending more time shopping, even things like dabbling in investing and so on. Going on Reddit and following the advice of everyone's an expert. These days leads to the opportunities for the exploitation of these consumers. The other dimension I think is worth considering is just how sort of tired and exhausted consumers are, and I think that leads to them putting their guard down, where in the past folks would have been a little more cautious, a little more attuned to something that seems a little bit out of the ordinary. Just the constant digital exposure, I think, leads a lot of consumers to maybe not pay as much attention. When you couple that with the fact, and I think Stephanie alluded to this a little bit, everybody's at home. The control systems aren't all in place to the same degree that they used to be. Folks are using personal computers that might not be as well secured as their regular corporate computers to get on Zoom calls or other things. Folks might not be doing a good enough job keeping virus and malware protection up to date. So all of those things, I think, increase the risk profile of the available risk vectors for the fraudsters to take advantage of. And so you are seeing, Stephanie, I loved your comment about the throw the spaghetti against the wall, sort of approach of many fraudsters to just see what sticks and what they can get. I mean, I think it was less than 24 hours after the big Rogers outage that I got, and I probably got 4 or 5 different, social engineering, SMS based, hey, we're really sorry, click here and we'll give you your $50 kind of thing, which I am sure was very lucrative for lots of fraudsters. So, that social engineering stuff, targeted, through social media is, I think, a huge and growing trend that's tied to the shift in consumers' perceptions and a decrease in sort of oversight from corporate bodies.
Wow, that's I love the perspectives that you all provided, and I look at us as individuals that work in the financial industry and aware of these threats and risks, and aware of cyber security and just fraud in general, where sometimes, to your point exactly, Andrew, the average Joe who's not as close to these issues and aware of fraud and the risk it presents, they might not be in tune of all the things that are happening in the environment, and so they definitely put their guards down. And to your point about shopping, I mean, I am one of the guilty ones where I'm using Amazon constantly, buying things. My husband hates it, but that's the only avenue I have right now to buy things for the household and the kids and so forth. But I love how Stephanie also brought up a really good point about there's millions of records out there since 2013. And you truly don't think, or at least myself, you don't think of fraud as, there's records out there, there's history, there's things out there and data that the fraudsters have access to. You always think it's them in the now, it's what's happening now or might happen now. So yeah, thank you very much for your perspectives. It's really eye-opening and really good feedback on different topics and areas of that spectrum. So organizations in general have fraud systems and tons of data, but sometimes there's noise. Sometimes there's false positives. And so how do you focus on the relevant data for fraud prevention versus dealing with the noise? Ugan, do you want to start?
Absolutely. We've come across organizations that, indeed do have many fraud systems, and in certain instances, lots of data as well. And this, really can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, more fraud systems and more data can certainly give you the ability to cover more of the bank and more of the channels, that larger attack surface that we all talk about. While on the other hand, more fraud systems and more data can also result in silos, spiraling costs, operational fatigue. We talked about that earlier. Eventually, this results in suboptimal fraud detection. Now, just generally speaking, we all know that in order to make more efficient decisions, we need the right information at the right time. Imagine if you need to make a decision about, let's assume a road trip. You need to make a decision about an off-ramp you need to take. You can't have the off-ramp signals being posted, a few kilometers after the off-ramp. It's too late. At the same time, it would be pretty annoying if you are looking for the off-ramp sign, but you see you're bombarded by millions of billboards along the way. And the one important signal you're waiting for, which is the instruction to turn, is lost in the noise. So that would be very distracting and wouldn't work too well. So this is no different in the fraud world, right? Transaction monitoring, fraud detection, analysis capabilities will really only be as good and fast as the payment transaction data we have access to. So getting back to your question, how do we filter out the noise and focus on the signals that truly lead us to identifying fraud? We believe that this starts with the right foundation, the right data foundation, I should say. Firstly, the right data foundation should be extensible and adaptable. So, when new attacks are carried out, we have the data at our fingertips to be able to support the controls we need to put in place. For example, pretty recently, we noticed transaction reversal fraud, plaguing organizations in Europe. If our data foundation is extensible and adaptable, bringing in sensor data into our fraud models to be able to easily detect this type of fraud would be simple as just dragging and dropping a new rule into our system. Secondly, part of that foundation, whatever we're doing should be ubiquitous in that it should cover every touch point, channel, rail in a typical payment environment. This, provides that end-to-end view of the customer behavior itself. It prevents blind spots. It allows fraud models to more precisely detect anomalous behavior. So to answer the question on, how do we filter out the noise? Well, certainly, I believe it isn't about having many systems and lots of data. And, at the risk of this sounding like a cliche, it certainly is more about the quality rather than the quantity.
Agreed. Andrew, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd like to just say what Ugan said, because he covered an awful lot of the topic. At the end of the day, it's not. I agree with the position that it's not just about getting as much data as you can possibly have and hoping that somehow it leads you, down the right path. It's really on making sure that the tools that do the analysis are, as effective as they need to be. This is the ongoing arms race that has existed between fraudsters and people trying to stop fraudsters, since the beginning of time. Both the tools and the technology that we implement have to always be trying to, keep ahead. And, they have unlimited resources to, implement whatever, tools and technology to subvert the latest thing we can put in. So we have to keep our foot on the gas, and we have to focus on sort of quality analysis. The trends in the industry, I think, have been interesting to watch, and need to continue. That continued move, for instance, away from just traditional rules based tripwire type systems, are absolutely need to be replaced with the systems that use machine learning and artificial intelligence to not only identify event occurrence, but also help dig out the trends, the indicators, the warning signs that something doesn't seem right. So and in all those models, if you put irrelevant data into those models, to Ugan's point, then you're going to decrease the effectiveness of that. So needing to make sure that your data models, where you're pulling your data are both comprehensive, making sure they cover all of the potential areas, as well as effective, is important as you create that sort of multi-layered filtering system to go in there. And then the last point that I think is again worth noting is there's always a consumer piece of this, right? So the consumer education trends and the needs to continue teaching, the average everyday people who don't spend their lives, thinking about this stuff as perhaps we do, needs to continue to happen, and to the degree that we can continue to help them understand when bad things appear to be happening, the better we can actually get a even earlier stage prevention, because they're going to avoid, the phishing attempt or whatever.
Agree. Stephanie, your thoughts?
So I agree with everything Ugan and Andrew said, and just a few other thoughts too. I think from trying to separate the noise from the focus, you start with whether you're a bank or whether you're a customer or a consumer. You need to think about what assets do I have? What assets are valuable to a fraudster to want to be able to acquire those assets? Because it's not just the pure movement of money, it could be monetization of other assets. And so when we look at fraud and what the different assets are, the different means for monetizing those assets is where we then identify what data do we need to have to be able to identify whether or not there is the potential for fraud or the potential for infiltration for that information. And then you have to look at, in my view, what across the life cycle of that activity, that transaction, or that asset value, how the fraudster could intercept, because there's often, particularly in a payment transaction, different places where the fraudster can intercept, either at the authentication layer or at the transaction layer, could infiltrate at the bank level or at the customer level. So you need to think through those life cycles from end to end, and then figure out what data do you need to either authenticate the individual or authenticate the transaction, as well as being able to identify those elements for protecting the asset in and of itself. And then to Ugan's point, lots of data isn't necessarily good. So going through that sort of analysis to be able to get to the quality of data, but you are still going to get a lot of data for sure. And that's where, the use of machine learning and use of artificial intelligence really becomes important, because there is so much data, and banks process hundreds of thousands of transactions every week, every month, every year, that the more data to some extent is good, because then you can identify what's the norm, what's the standard acceptable behavior that would be expected of a particular transaction, of a particular customer, of a particular industry in a particular jurisdiction. So then you can level set and baseline that information. The other information then becomes what's the anomalies against that baseline. And so that's where your machine learning and AI comes in, because it can kick out, which is what the models do, what your rules do, to kick out into your operations teams to investigate whether or not it actually is or isn't fraud. And the outcome of those investigations is equally important because it allows banks to take that learning to say, yes, this was confirmed fraud, and feed that back into the machine learning or the AI model or the rules to say, yes, that was valid, that was good, that's a good data point, that's a good element to solidify your foundational understanding of how fraud can occur. And likewise, for those alerts that were not confirmed fraud, that didn't become fraud, why did it kick out as an alert? And those elements of learning are just as important in your rules and your models as well, to help try and weed out that the noise from the focus as well going forward. But it is an ongoing, continuous learning process. And you know, I feed back to what Andrew was saying. You need to understand the industry. You need to understand how things are moving, and also feed in those intelligence components from the industry as well. Because fraudsters, as we all know, get really good at hiding amongst the common. And so you have to get sometimes into more minutia and more, even more sharpened focus to be able to identify those nuanced behaviors that do set themselves apart from what a normal person, than the actual person's account would actually look like. There are clues there. They may not be as explicit because fraudsters learn. So your foundational baseline has to continue to evolve and learn so that you don't get so many false positives and you are actually being able to identify true confirmed fraud.
Thank you. That is really great insight. So, if I can summarize, we've talked about separating the noise from the genuine fraudulent transactions. We talked about why there are so many false positives out there, and what can we really do to reduce them going forward. But I really love what you've all said, and me personally, as someone who owns Wires and manages that service, for me, I'm writing notes, I'm sure you've noticed, but there's lots of good feedback and things to consider when launching any service or even the existing services. But I love how you said, continue learning. It's a learning process using quality, comprehensive data, not just quantity, and using the right tools to help you decipher fraud and mitigate against fraud and stop fraud. So definitely a lot of things for me to think about and consider in anything that I do in the future as a product person. So what opportunities and challenges for financial institutions and merchants do you see emerging in the fraud prevention space, and specifically as it relates to payments? And what work are each of you doing in your areas to mitigate that? Stephanie, can we start with you?
Sure. I think building off of what I just said, it's really understanding all the different avenues and different areas that fraud can be perpetrated, and taking a layered approach as well. And what I mean by that is, again, you need to authenticate, is this the right person who should be doing what it is they're asking to be done? And that could be as simple as a maintenance change, like adding a new person to a bank account who has the ability to now move money on those bank accounts. Are they allowed to do that? To, is the individual allowed to actually move money, create the wire, etc. So understanding, again, all those layers and having an approach across all of those layers. I go back to what Ugan had said earlier as well, which was, in many cases, there are lots of silos across the different payment types or transaction types that can occur. And so you have different fraud systems. There's an element of, there's so many different ways of committing fraud across the different channels, etc. So how do you weave those pieces together so you can get a holistic view? Because at the end of the day, the fraudster, if they found a way in, they're not just going to go after my one bank account. They're going to go after all my bank accounts, my RSP account, do a drawdown on my loan. Maybe I'm part of another entity. So you have to also be able to take a step back and look at the holistic picture of who is Stephanie and who is she connected with, and what all the other avenues can they traverse to also commit fraud, perhaps in other avenues and other pieces of what I do with the financial institution. I think one of the greatest challenges for us in the fraud business is this is a 24/7, 365 day, every year activity. I think Andrew had said the fraudsters, this is their job. This is what they do all day, every day. They're well funded in many cases. So they have the same aptitude and understanding of how to use AI and machine learning. And as they test and learn different tactics with each financial institution, each organization, they too continue to learn and refine and etc. So it's about trying to stay one step ahead of them. And I think the other thing that was already mentioned here too as a challenge is the types of fraud, the frequency and transition of attack vectors continues to evolve exponentially against the different types of payment types and different channels that are being introduced into the market every single day. We have instant payments coming in Canada soon. That's going to create a whole new layer and avenue for fraudsters to be able to attack our financial institutions, as well as attack our customers and their accounts as well. And so, we learned from other jurisdictions that have already gone through that, but there will be some pain. And there will be a fair amount of learning as that comes into place. But I think from an opportunities perspective, there are lots of really smart people and lots of great organizations that spend their days and evenings thinking about this to try and help us combat this. We have gotten much better in sharing across the industry, in sharing with law enforcement, in learning, as I said, from cross-jurisdictional things that are seen in other areas. And I think by recognizing that this is we're in it together, we have to help each other. This is not a single entity combating this situation is the way that we're going to move forward and try and get and stay in front of the bad actors collectively.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have to stick together in order to survive and be 10 steps ahead. Ugan, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, there were some interesting sort of points that Stephanie raised, and the one that that resonates pretty well with me is the fact that we need to work together, try and find some way that we can be ahead of the curve. I see that as a huge opportunity because usually fraudsters would try out specific attacks in certain parts of the world, certain regions, and the sooner other parts of the world can gain knowledge of that, the sooner we can put up the controls to stop that. So certainly, I think that's a fantastic opportunity. But just with basically our global customer base itself, I would say we've noticed three major trends that certainly brought opportunities and challenges, and those being, we touched on one earlier, the acceleration of digital transformation. Open banking is also another exciting area, as well as the development of real-time payments. I mean, many other parts of the world have already deployed these capabilities, and I know Canada is now, in the midst of it. But certainly, there's lots of learnings in that space as well. So, we should not head into this, not knowing too much, because we've already got prototypes and other guinea pigs around the world. Sorry for me using that The acceleration of digital transformation I would say, has been largely driven by COVID-19. That certainly increased the speed of payment fraud. Sometimes it moved, I think, pretty quickly. So, financial institutions, online, merchants really had to, in certain instances, play catch up, with this new way of working. So while digital transformation in certain respects makes, doing business more cost effective, it also enhances customer engagement. There are many challenges from a fraud perspective, where we've seen probably over the last 2 decades, the barrage of attacks, when people or geography start moving to card not present transactions. Open banking allows organizations to, provide these customized products and services that boost customer experience. It also helps with customer retention. And as much as it presents huge opportunities for banks and fintechs, keeping that balance between customer friction and efficient fraud prevention is, I would say, definitely a challenge. Real-time payments, presents huge opportunities for banks, but I feel in combination with open banking, there really is this ability to disrupt existing payment methods, as well as provide alternatives to online payments. By the very nature of it being real-time payments and real-time clearing makes it, I would say, pretty lucrative sort of opportunities for fraudsters. Now, just getting back to the work that we are doing in this area, we help organizations gain access to the visibility into these real-time payment and open banking transactions. It's important that we are able to, trace back a consumer request with the request that comes in from any API or goes out via an RTP rail. And because, we have systems right now that are able to capture this, independently across all these channels, we don't impact the transaction in any way. And by, I would say, some of the items that Stephanie talked about, using more cutting edge and sometimes highly performant machine learning, where we can dump large amounts of data to these models and behavioral profile, we can detect more types of fraud faster and more accurately.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, looking at open banking, real-time payment, real-time settlement, it's all great opportunities for the financial ecosystem. But it's finding that balance, right? Doing things and being creative and innovative, but at the same time being careful as well. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the increasing complexity, right? There's a strong focus, as there absolutely should be, on customer experience, and even when you think about false positives and how we can deal with some of those things, it's really important that we keep that customer experience view as a major focus. Like we all know, we could get fraud pretty close to zero if we just stop processing transactions. It's not gonna help our businesses. It's not gonna help the consumers live the lives that they need to live. So that's always a trade-off, right? An exercise of sort of finding the effective ways to give consumers what they need and new and interesting things to do. But to Ugan's point, the world is changing so rapidly around us, and we are a little bit like, if you can think of a positive for how slowly Canada is progressing down the path of open banking and real-time payments and so on, it's that we do have the opportunity to look over somebody else's shoulder and see where they've maybe stubbed their toe or skinned their knee. And hopefully not, experience those same sorts of things. But as we do that, the pieces of the system become more disconnected, become more distributed. This, plug and play, approach to open banking, where we're going to use, lots of third parties who have great ideas and great technologies, and we're going to, assemble them. Either we're going to assemble them as, being financial services providers, or perhaps our consumers are going to assemble them on their own behalf. And so you don't have the sort of overarching command and control approach that perhaps you used to have when everything was in one data center in one place, or with at least within the control of a single organization. So that leads you very quickly, I think, to really needing sort of this multi-layered approach where we make sure that fraud's appropriately considered in each of the pieces of this puzzle. And when we think about our focus, we're not a financial institution, and we don't deal directly in the fraud management stuff, but we do work with solution providers. And so we have to make sure that as we filter out and find providers, we have to make sure that they've done their work to make sure they've considered it. So when it gets brought in and made a part of the bigger offering, that there isn't a massive gap, or that it can be used to integrate into the data systems that are being used with the modern technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, to be able to effectively fit into those ecosystems. So it's about managing through that complexity. It's about making sure, to Stephanie's point, you just can't take your foot off the gas on this stuff. It has always been a 24/7 thing. It will always be a 24/7 thing. And the moment you let your guard down, somebody's right there preparing themselves to take advantage of whatever gap you leave. So, all those things need to be part. There are few, unfortunately, big step function changes that are going to have massive, helpful things. I mean, maybe I'm too pessimistic on that, but I think of, the implementation of EMV and chip card, and what a substantial impact that had on card fraud in the debit space in particular. Those are few and far between. They don't come around every day. So it's hard work, staying on top of things, moving forward, trying to stay ahead, or at least at par with the people who are trying to take other people's money.
So what I've heard is basically, leverage from looking across our shoulder to other jurisdictions and learn from them, lessons learned, and try not to repeat the same errors or mistakes, but also leverage third-party providers and outside help if needed, but also have multi-layer approach and authentication, use artificial intelligence and machine learning to our advantage to help us, tools that we have at hand to help us prevent and reduce fraud. So thank you. That's all great. I'm really going away with really good notes here, so thanks for that. Thank you all so much for your time today. And before we go, I do want to do another round for closing, just to hear your last thoughts on the topic and how we can mitigate fraud in general in the future, especially real-time rails and instant coming soon to the market in Canada. I'll start with Andrew.
Yeah, so I mean, great session. I also appreciate learning lots from Stephanie and Ugan. It's a big topic and an important topic. It's one of those background topics that if we do our jobs right, most consumers don't really have a lot of visibility into it, and so on. So, to reiterate my points from a few minutes ago, making sure we don't lose track of that consumer experience in our strive to batten down the hatches and make things safer is really important. I think we benefit from the fact that the advances in technology are there. The ability to use, fraud orchestration models to integrate data from multiple layers and multiple, systems will help. But it's hard work to do that, and we need to just carry on. Again, I'll reiterate the need to not forget about educating consumers, because that prevention side of the equation is really, really important, and it's not necessarily fun stuff to talk about. So we need to continue our efforts in that regard as well. And then, of course, we all need to wash our hands and wear masks and socially distance ourselves from fraudsters. Yeah.
And stay healthy. Yes. Stephanie, your thoughts?
I'm not sure that I can add too much more to what Andrew had said, but so maybe I'll just build upon some of those comments. On the consumer experience piece, I think that absolutely we have to stay conscious of that, and that's a balance between the risk appetite and being able to protect the financial institution or the monetary loss and provide a great customer experience ongoing. but I think a part of that consumer experience is where you were leading to, Andrew, which is that customer awareness and customer education. And I think it's, what some organizations feel it is, help them understand what is fraud, but it's more around, I think, extending that, what is fraud, how is fraud perpetrated, and their role in the prevention of fraud. Because a lot of what we see with business email compromise and phishing, etc., which is the predicate cyber activity that comes in advance of a fraudulent activity, we don't necessarily do a great job in connecting those dots to that. You have a business email compromise and then the fraud occurs, and helping the customers understand that life cycle or that chain of those activities that got them into this situation. And not to scare customers, but to try and have our environment, our consumers understand and have a healthy dose of skepticism of, why did I get this email? I didn't apply for a credit card. Well, maybe you should go now check your credit bureau to see whether or not someone applied for a credit card in your name, right? To Andrew's point, why am I getting these emails for outages from Rogers? Yes, there was an outage, but this isn't norm. This is back to, that why are they emailing me? Why are they asking me for information? Why am I getting this information if I never asked for it, never saw for it, etc.? Those are all avenues of fraudsters using social behavior, social engineering activities to try and, again, acquire more information in order to perpetrate fraud somewhere down the road. So that education piece is really important, and unfortunately building that aspect of skepticism in our environment. It's a terrible thing to have to say and perhaps have to do. And, my kids will tell you that I'm off the charts on the skepticism side, but that avenue is one that will help us collectively in this, in combating fraud, because this is a team sport, and not just team with regards to those of us in the financial space or those serving solutions for preventing fraud. It is also the governments, the regulators, and the consumers themselves. It is a team sport, and without the team, this doesn't work.
100% I agree. Ugan.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the point on, that Andrew and Stephanie brought up, especially around awareness, making consumers aware, exactly of all these elaborate schemes, and, just being able to, I think, figure out using sometimes common sense, because, the fraud syndicates out there can, put out really complex sort of attacks, but sometimes just using common sense and trying to evade these sort of attacks or sort of attempts at getting access to user accounts. And that's sometimes the hardest thing is the softer aspects of putting controls in place, right? It's easy to put the technologies down, but training individuals, especially such a varied audience, such a varied consumer base, where you have, right now, youngsters who have bank accounts, and even, much older people. And, the technologies you use and the sort of mediums you use to be able to communicate to them can be pretty different. So that's a really good point. I would say if the last 20 odd years are anything to go by, then we know cybercrime and fraud syndicates are pretty much here to stay. And again, things that Andrew and Stephanie mentioned, the job of fighting fraud and the teams within organizations that fight fraud, that job never ends. But I do feel it is incumbent on us to ensure that we continue to block those fraud patterns, of yesterday, today. But at the same time, we should be able to predict the attacks of tomorrow, to stay ahead of the curve, so that our organizations just don't become another statistic. We talked about improving overall customer experience. We know that is the cornerstone of almost every organization. And at the end of the day, I think this should be the key driving force behind fraud prevention. Whatever solutions we put in place should ultimately facilitate business and allow for easier and smoother customer interactions. And I would say, at least over the last 2 decades, we've seen that really controlling systems move away from that centralized control to more opening up the environment, opening up the boundaries, but at the same time knowing your customers pretty well. We know that with the plethora of new services, new payment schemes, payment types, that fraud will continue to move from channel to channel. And we have to make sure we have this comprehensive view of what's going on. And I would say, we should aim for that in a single system. Honestly, there's no reason for us to have so many different systems and solutions in place and still have blind spots. I feel, one of the sort of major driving forces in systems right now, like both Andrew and Stephanie talked about, is machine learning. We need to take machine learning to the next sort of level. I feel what we have in machine learning right now leaves much to be desired. We should be building behavioral models for each and every customer. We should be knowing these behavioral models intimately. Our systems need to know that, not only to better serve these customers, but to be able to trust the attributes that make up that identity. So with that, I would say, I feel we need to usher in the next era in payment fraud detection, where more relevant data is acquired, at lightning speed. More granular fraud models are created, going right down to the individual user behavior level. And we need to move away from data and fraud silos, look at fraud holistically and across every touch point in an organization.
Thank you all so much. I really loved having this conversation. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Yeah, definitely, I do agree with you. Consumer awareness and making sure they understand and helping them be part of that team to prevent fraud going forward. It is definitely key. And thank you. Thank you again, once again, for being here today. Stay healthy and safe, and take care.